Before dawn breaks on March 1st, 1692, in a cramped wooden room in Salem Village, there is a sound you will never hear in any official record. It is the sound of women breathing in the dark. Their breath is shallow. The air smells of smoke from a poorly tended fire, and beneath that, something sharper, the metallic tang of fear. On a table beside them lies a piece of paper. The ink is still wet. Names written down, accusations transcribed, and then silence. A silence that will last for centuries. Within hours, that document will be the most powerful thing in this room. More powerful than prayer, more powerful than truth. In a moment, you will understand why these women's words, the very words they spoke in defense, became the instrument of their own erasure. You will learn how a town built a system not to find witches, but to guarantee that the female voice, once recorded, could be reinterpreted, doubted, and ultimately destroyed. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Salem Village in 1692 was not a place of obvious darkness. It was a frontier settlement where women had specific roles, and those roles were carefully bounded. A woman might counsel her husband in private. She might manage a household. She might attend church and listen to sermons about female submission, a sermon heard so often it became the architecture of her own thoughts. The town kept its order this way, not through violence yet, but through structure, through habit, through the simple understanding that a woman's voice had a place, and that place was narrow. Margaret Thorne kept that place. So did Anne Foster. So did Bridget Bishop. They were neither rich nor poor. They were visible enough to be known, invisible enough to be forgotten. This was the order that would soon be disrupted. Not by witchcraft, but by the machinery of documentation. If the mechanisms of power and silence interest you, how systems use women's words against them, how institutions erase the inconvenient, consider subscribing. The story of how this happened in Salem is the story of how it still happens now. In February 1692, two girls in Salem Village, Betty Paris and Anne Lewis, ages 9 and 11, began to convulse. Their bodies twisted. They screamed. They claimed invisible hands were pinching them, clawing at their skin. A local physician, William Griggs, examined them carefully. He found no natural cause. He spoke the word that would change everything: witchcraft. Within days, other girls reported the same afflictions. Mercy Lewis, 17 years old, said something was crushing her chest. Susanna Sheldon, her hands gripped by unseen forces. The symptoms spread not randomly, but along social lines. The afflicted were almost entirely young, unmarried women and adolescent girls, and they all named their attackers. All women. All older women. All women who, in some way, had stepped outside the bounds of accepted behavior. What emerged in Salem was not a panic. Panic is formless. This was architecture. The magistrates appointed to investigate, William Hathorne and John Hathorne, did not arrive in chaos. They arrived with procedure. On March 1st, 1692, Sarah Good was brought before them. She was homeless, poor, and known for her sharp tongue. Anne Foster was called next, then Tituba, an enslaved woman brought from Barbados. And then the women who were not accused came forward as witnesses. They described what they had seen: invisible forces, strange marks on the girl's skin. The afflicted pointed directly at the accused during examination, and their fits would intensify. It was compelling testimony. It was also precisely choreographed, though no one present would have called it that. The afflicted girls had discovered something profound. If they spoke, they were believed. If they accused, action followed. If they convulsed at the right moment, the machinery of justice would turn. The system required witnesses. The system required women to testify. And for a brief moment, women's words had unprecedented power. Margaret Thorne testified that she saw witchcraft. Mary Osgood gave a deposition describing supernatural attacks. Deodat Lawson, a visiting minister, documented these testimonies in careful, measured language. The women who spoke became part of the official record. Their words were written down. They were sworn. They mattered. But the moment their words entered the document, their authority began to dissolve. Documentation does not preserve meaning. It captures it, reduces it, sets it in amber, and then controls who can interpret it. The affidavits and depositions accumulated. The magistrates read them not as evidence of genuine distress, but as proof of crime. The women had spoken. Now the women would be classified. Between March and September 1692, 20 people were executed in Salem. 14 of them were women. But before the executions came the interrogations. The accused were asked to confess. Some resisted. Anne Foster, a midwife, admitted to witchcraft but claimed she had never harmed anyone. Bridget Bishop denied everything. Giles Corey, an elderly man, refused to enter a plea, a refusal that cost him his life under the weight of pressing stones. But the accused women faced a different pressure. They were offered a conditional mercy. If they confessed, if they named other witches, if they testified against their neighbors, they might be spared. This was not mercy. This was a mechanism of control. A woman who confessed implicated others. A woman who refused to confess was punished with death. A woman who confessed but refused to name accomplices was punished with imprisonment. There was no path to safety. There was only a path to complicity. Consider the position of Tituba, the enslaved woman who testified at the earliest hearings. She did not deny witchcraft. She described a tall man from Boston, a conspiracy, other witches unknown. Her testimony was detailed and credible, and it fed the fear growing through Salem. But Tituba's words were filtered through an interpreter, filtered through the magistrate's understanding, filtered through the assumption that an enslaved woman from Barbados would know about witchcraft because of her origins, her race, her status. Her testimony was believed because it confirmed what the magistrates wanted to believe. She was never tried or executed. She simply disappeared from the record, eventually sold away. Her voice had been useful until it was no longer needed. The women who were executed, Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Sarah Wilds, George Burroughs, John Proctor, all maintained their innocence until the end. Their final words were often not recorded. When they were recorded by figures like Deodat Lawson, those words were transcribed in ways that emphasized their defiance, their stubbornness, their refusal to accept the judgment of the court. In death, even their silence could be reinterpreted. A woman who went to the gallows without confessing was not courageous. She was guilty. Her refusal to break was evidence of witchcraft itself. The system had become unassailable. Every outcome confirmed its logic. But some women broke under the pressure. Some of the afflicted girls later retracted their accusations. Ann Putnam, Jr., who had been among the most visible and vocal accusers, signed a confession in 1706 claiming she had been deluded. She was 26 years old. Mercy Lewis stopped testifying and faded into obscurity. Susanna Sheldon left no further record. Yet their earlier testimony had already done its work. 20 people were dead. The families were shattered. The property was seized. The paperwork was filed away. And the retraction of testimony from a young woman was treated not as a correction of injustice, but as the natural conclusion of a phase in her life. Women's words, it turned out, had always been contingent. They were believed when they served authority. They were questioned when they threatened it. And when they were finally withdrawn, it was accepted as the natural inconstancy of the female mind. What remains of the Salem trials is mostly paper, depositions, confessions, interrogation records, petitions signed by family members pleading for mercy. What does not remain, with equal clarity, are the women's own reflections on what was done to them. Were they genuinely convinced they had witnessed witchcraft? Were they conscious of the power their accusations gave them? Were they afraid? The historical record does not say, because the historical record was written by men, magistrates, ministers, later historians, who needed the events to make sense within a framework of reason, a framework in which women's perception of reality could be questioned, their motivations scrutinized, and their ultimate reliability dismissed. The very fact that some recanted was used as proof that their gender made them unreliable narrators of truth. The trials formally ended in October 1692, when the magistrate, William Stoughton, stopped accepting spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted girls about invisible attackers. No new arrests followed. But the silence that came was not the silence of resolution, it was the silence of suppression. The families of the executed had to live in the same town with the families of the accusers. The surviving women who had testified had to face women whose relatives they had helped condemn. The system had fractured its own foundation. In 1711, the colony passed a law restoring the rights of the accused and ordering restitution to their families. The language was careful, legalistic. It did not say the trials were a travesty. It said the trials had been mischievous and that the law had been not strictly observed. Those accused were not declared innocent. They were declared to have been wronged. A small difference in wording, a profound difference in meaning. But words alone could not contain what had happened. The town still held its silence, and the silence still held the town. For decades, the women of Salem could not speak publicly about what had happened. The afflicted girls faced a kind of social death. Those who had accused were ostracized, not because they had lied, but because the town needed to forget. The mechanisms of erasure were not crude, they were subtle. The trials were not forbidden to mention, they were simply never again discussed in formal settings. No sermon addressed the injustice. No town meeting revisited the procedures. The records were not destroyed. They were simply left unexamined. Files of testimony accumulated dust in archives where few would think to look. In 1953, playwright Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible, adapting the trials as an allegory for McCarthyism. The play became famous. Millions learned about Salem. But they learned about it through the lens of male dramatization. The play's protagonist is John Proctor, a man. The afflicted girls are portrayed as cynical and conniving. The power dynamics are flattened. The women's actual testimonies are simplified. The historical record, once again, did the work of distortion. What we know about the social pressure that silenced the witnesses of Salem comes primarily from their own retractions and from the gaps in the historical record. Ann Putnam Jr.'s confession, written when she was an adult, 14 years after the trials, describes being influenced and deluded by Satan. 14 years of silence, and then this single sentence explaining everything. This is not her reflection on what happened. This is the only language the community would accept for her survival within it. Mercy Lewis left Salem entirely. She changed her name when she married. She appears once more in the records as a woman who had recovered from her afflictions. Recovery. The word itself is revealing. As if she had been ill, not testifying. As if her words had been a symptom to be cured, not evidence to be examined. The subtext of these records is that the women were victims of their own nature, emotional, unreliable, susceptible to delusion. not victims of a system that had weaponized their vulnerability and then discarded them. The trial records themselves contain moments of raw hesitation from the very women whose accusations had been foundational. During Rebecca Nurse's examination, several women who had testified against her signed a petition claiming they had been wrong, not forced, not coerced by any recorded magistrate. They simply petitioned, saying, "We were mistaken." But the magistrates did not release Rebecca Nurse. Instead, they questioned the women who had recanted. How could they now claim the witch had never harmed them? How could they reverse what had been so clearly documented? One of these women, Mary Osgood, eventually withdrew her retraction. She returned to her original testimony, not because she believed it, but because she could not sustain the pressure of contradicting the official record. In the magistrate's logic, the original testimony was true because it was first. The recantation was suspect because it came later and because it came from women. Female testimony, once recorded, could be discredited by female testimony that followed it. The document itself became a weapon against the very people who had created it. By the time the colony officially acknowledged the trials as an injustice in 1711, the living witnesses were already constructed as unreliable narrators. The afflicted girls had been young and suggestible at the time. The accused had been stubborn in their denial. The accusers had been deluded. The ministers had been credulous. Everyone shared in the collective fiction that this had been a mistake, not a system working precisely as designed, but an aberration, a moment when the mechanisms of justice had malfunctioned. This interpretation was necessary. If the trials were a system, if they were designed to extract confession through psychological pressure, if they were built on the systematic destruction of female testimony and credibility, then the entire framework of social order would have to be questioned. It was far easier to say that Satan had briefly held dominion over Salem and then had been cast out. Far easier than saying that men had created a procedure that turned women's words against them, and that procedure had worked exactly as intended. The most haunting absence from the historical record of Salem is the day after. After Rebecca Nurse or Sarah Good or any of the 20 were hanged, the town continued. The women who had testified went about their lives. The magistrates returned to their homes. The afflicted girls grew older. No one was required to process what had happened. No mechanism for collective reckoning existed. The only choice available was silence or revisionism. The records show that in later years, survivors of the trials who had testified began to leave Salem. They relocated to other colonies. They wanted distance from what they had witnessed and participated in. Some, like Mercy Lewis, simply vanished from documentation. Others, like Ann Putnam Jr., lived in Salem but were never recorded as holding any further public voice. Their silence was not chosen. It was the only option left in a society that had decided the trials would not be examined. The trials of Salem ended in October 1692, but the system that had created them did not disappear. It transformed. The mechanisms of social pressure that had silenced women's testimony during the trials, doubt cast on their perceptions, their records weaponized against them, their words reinterpreted by authorities, their refusal to conform treated as proof of guilt, these mechanisms persisted. They were embedded in the language of law. They were reinforced in sermons about female weakness. They appeared in medical texts that described women as inherently hysteria-prone. The trials did not fail to produce justice. They produced a lesson. Women's words could be made to serve authority, and when they no longer did, women could be made to disappear. Today, historians offer us explanations that allow us to feel safe about Salem. Some emphasize the ergot fungus theory, that the accusers suffered from poisoning and hallucinated. Some point to social tensions in the community, boundary disputes between families that predated the trials. Some focus on the psychology of adolescent girls in a repressive society. All of these explanations are plausible. All of them are, in some way, probably true. But they all serve the same function. They explain the trials as the product of something external, a poison, a conflict, a psychological pathology, something that happened then that we have now moved beyond. They do not address what the trials actually demonstrate about how systems of authority use testimony from people without power. They do not examine how the documentation process itself can become an instrument of control. They do not ask why it took us 300 years to notice that almost everyone who confessed to witchcraft was a woman, and almost everyone who refused to confess and was executed was also a woman. They do not make you sit with this question. The difference between the confessor and the executed was not guilt. It was how each responded to the machinery of interrogation. And if that machinery still exists, if we still have documentation, if we still have authority, if we still have women without power, then what? The theories let us avoid the answer. In 2001, the state of Massachusetts formally exonerated the victims of the Salem trials. The exoneration came 309 years after the last execution. The language used was precise and legalistic. The trials were the product of judicial error and tragic miscarriage of justice. The victims' names were listed. The state acknowledged wrongdoing. Surviving relatives could claim compensation. But the exoneration itself was an act of history writing. It allowed the present to appear merciful in relation to the past. It allowed contemporary institutions of justice to present themselves as reformed, enlightened, beyond the barbarities of 1692. What it did not do was examine the mechanisms by which women's testimony could still be discredited, still be reinterpreted, still be filtered through institutions designed to doubt it. The trials became a story about the past, a cautionary tale about what happens when superstition goes unchecked. Not a story about how authority uses testimony and how that use has not fundamentally changed. The women of Salem left us something in the archive. Not their own words about their own experience. That would have required them to write history themselves, which they were not permitted to do. But traces. Gaps where their voice should be. Depositions that betray hesitation in the original script. Moments where the magistrate's transcription seems to contradict what was said. Petitions signed by family members on behalf of the accused because the accused themselves were not allowed to petition. The scratching out of names in margins of documents, names added and then crossed through. The list of the executed, with ages and professions recorded, but with no account of their final words unless those words served the interests of the record keeper. The testimony of Ann Putnam, Jr., given 60 years after the trials, in which she claims that the afflicted girl's accusations were delusions. This testimony was accepted not because it revealed truth, but because it allowed the community to move on. It permitted the trials to be categorized as a failure of discernment rather than as a working system. What would it mean to read the Salem records differently? Not as a story of justice temporarily misdirected, but as a precise documentation of how a system turns testimony from vulnerable people into instruments of control. To notice that the girls who testified were given unprecedented authority. That authority extended only as long as their accusations served institutional interests. That once the trials ended, those same girls were discredited as hysterical or deluded. To recognize that the women who were executed maintained their innocence, and that their refusal to confess was treated not as courage, but as stubbornness, as further proof of guilt. To observe that the women who were accused had no mechanism for defending themselves except by accepting the terms of the system, by confessing, by naming others, by demonstrating the appropriate emotions at the appropriate moments. And to ask, what has changed? Salem was 1692. It was a moment when the mechanisms of power were unusually visible, unusually brutal, unusually well documented. But the methods were not unique to Salem, and they did not end in 1692. The systematic discrediting of women's testimony, the filtering of those words through institutional interpretation, the weaponizing of documentation against the documented, the pressure to confess to things not done in order to survive, these persist. They appear in courtrooms where sexual assault survivors are cross-examined about what they wore. They appear in institutions where women's psychiatric testimony is weighted less heavily than men's because of assumptions about female hysteria, assumptions that trace directly back to Salem. They appear in workplaces where women report harassment and are told that their perception of events is somehow mistaken, that they have misunderstood intention, that they are too sensitive. The language changes, the mechanisms remain. We do not know with certainty what the girls of Salem truly experienced. Were they conscious of their deception? Did they believe their own accusations? Were they simply responding to the attention and power their claims granted them? The archive does not tell us. It tells us only what was officially recorded, which is to say, only what served the magistrate's purposes. It tells us that these girls' words were believed until they were not, that their authority was granted and then revoked, that their later retractions were accepted as the natural return to female unreliability. The archive tells us that the women accused, whether they confessed or maintained their innocence, were trapped within a system that had no path to justice for them. It tells us that the community, having used their words and bodies as tools of social control, then turned away. It tells us that this turning away was so complete that for centuries, the trials were remembered as a story about mass hysteria, not about institutional violence. The final words of Rebecca Nurse, one of the executed, were reportedly, "I am innocent, and God will clear my innocence." She maintained her denial until death. The magistrates recorded her words not as an assertion of truth, but as final proof of her guilt. Witches being known for their stubbornness, their refusal to bend to authority, their defiant pride. Nothing Rebecca Nurse could have said would have saved her. If she had confessed, she would have died as a penitent witch. If she maintained her innocence, she died as a defiant witch. If she had begged for mercy, she would have died as a manipulative witch. The system had constructed itself such that every possible response confirmed its logic. And when she was gone, her words were filed away. Her name appeared in church records, in property deeds, in the genealogies of families that eventually wanted to distance themselves from her. The archive preserved her, but only as a name, only as something that happened, not as a person who was heard, considered, and then destroyed. This is where we stand with Salem. The trials are history. The victims are dead. The magistrates are dead. The afflicted girls are dead. What remains is a problem of interpretation. We know that 20 people were executed. We know their names. We know some of their last words. We know which girls accused whom. We know what was written in the court records. We do not know what was not written. We do not know what the accused women thought as they sat in the darkness before their interrogation, listening to voices outside the door. We do not know what the afflicted girls felt when they realized their words had led to execution. We do not know what the magistrates told themselves in the years after about the justice of their actions. The absence of this knowledge is not accidental. It is the deliberate erasure that follows any use of testimony from people without power. You speak. Your words are recorded. Your words are used. Your words are then interpreted away. Your voice is forgotten. And the system that did this will point to the records and claim that it has preserved your memory. What we can ask, looking at Salem from the vantage point of 2024, is whether we have changed. Have we built better systems for protecting the testimony of people without power? Have we stopped weaponizing the confessions of vulnerable people? Have we stopped discrediting women's accounts of their own experience? Have we stopped allowing institutions to interpret and reinterpret women's words until they mean whatever serves institutional interests? When a woman comes forward today with an accusation of abuse, and she is asked what she wore, what she drank, why she did not report it sooner, whether she might have misunderstood intention, is that system fundamentally different from Salem? When a woman's psychiatrist dismisses her account as hysterical, when her employer suggests she is too sensitive, when her family says she is causing trouble by speaking, is that system fundamentally different from Salem? When a woman recants an accusation, is she believed? Or is her recantation treated as proof of the original unreliability of female testimony? These are not questions about the past. These are questions about what we have inherited. Salem ended. The trials stopped. The executions ceased. Life continued. The community chose silence and then reinterpretation. The afflicted girls grew into women who would not speak of what they had done. The accusers and the accused lived in the same town, a fact so unbearable that survivors eventually had to leave. The magistrates went home and lived with what they had done, or lived without examining what they had done, which is perhaps the same thing. The church that had endorsed the trials later called for a day of prayer and fasting to atone for them. Atonement is not the same as justice. It is the community turning away from the precipice, looking back only long enough to say, "We were wrong," before moving forward. The women and men who had been executed were not restored. Their property was not fully returned. Their names were remembered, but their voices were not recovered. The archive contains what they said at trial, but not what they thought, not what they felt, not what they understood about themselves. One woman remains in the silence. Bridget Bishop was the first person executed in Salem. She was accused of witchcraft, convicted, and hanged on June 10, 1692. Her trial record is brief. The afflicted girls accused her. Witnesses testified about strange occurrences in her presence. She maintained her innocence. The jury found her guilty. Her execution is documented in a single sentence in some records, omitted entirely in others. After her death, there is nothing. No will, no property dispute, no record of anyone claiming her body. It is as if, once she was executed, she ceased to exist. She became simply the woman who was first. Not first to be convicted, there was a trial. Not first to be accused, there were earlier accusations that did not lead to execution. But first to be hanged for witchcraft in Salem in 1692. The distinction is small. The consequence was absolute. Bridget Bishop's absence from the subsequent record is not accidental. Women accused of witchcraft were supposed to disappear. The accusation itself was a form of social erasure. You are accused, therefore you are dangerous, therefore you must be removed, therefore you must be forgotten. The documentation of the trial was not documentation of the person. It was documentation of the process that unmade her. When we read the trial record, we are not meeting Bridget Bishop. We are meeting a woman who is being systematically destroyed by an institutional procedure. A procedure that required her testimony, then discredited it, then used her refusal to confess against her. What appears in the archive as history is the moment of erasure itself, carefully documented, filed away, made to seem like justice. The weight of this realization is what the present moment forces upon us. Salem was not a moment of madness followed by enlightenment. It was a moment when the mechanisms that had always controlled women's testimony became unusually visible. Spectral evidence sounds absurd to us now. A woman pointing at invisible forces, the victim convulsing at the right moment, the magistrate recording it all. It seems like theater, like superstition, like the kind of error that could not happen now. But the theater of the trial is not what mattered. What mattered was the result. What mattered was that women's words were solicited, recorded, and then reinterpreted to serve the interests of authority. What mattered was that once a woman's word was written down, she had less control over it than she ever would again. What mattered was that the system was designed such that there was no path to truth, only a path to the next step of the procedure. And what matters now is that this system is not in the past. It is in every moment when a woman is asked to testify about her own experience and is then told she misunderstood it. It is in every moment when her words are recorded and later used against her in a way she did not intend. It is in every moment when she is offered the choice to confess to something false to survive, or to maintain her truth and be destroyed. The trials of Salem ended in the autumn of 1692. The executions ceased because the magistrate William Stoughton stopped accepting spectral evidence. One reason given for this shift was that the afflicted girls had begun to name women of higher social status, women whose families had power, women whose reputations could not be easily destroyed. The system broke when it reached its own limits. It broke when the women being accused began to matter too much to lose. The trials could continue as long as they consumed women without social power, women who were homeless, poor, foreign, aged, eccentric, marginal. But when the accusations moved upward into society, the mechanism had to shut down. The decision to stop the trials was not a moral awakening. It was a calculation of acceptable loss. The women who had already been executed had been acceptable losses. The women who would have been next were not. In the decades following Salem, the trials were discussed but not examined. They were treated as a discrete event, a moment of aberration, not as a revelation of how the system functioned. The afflicted girls were retrospectively diagnosed with ergot poisoning, or mass psychosis, or adolescent hysteria, or simple fraud. Any explanation that attributed the trials to an external cause was preferred to the explanation that they were precisely what authority intended: an orderly extraction of testimony from women, followed by the systematic destruction of that testimony, followed by the women's disappearance. If Salem had been about justice, the women would have been exonerated. If it had been about error, the error would have been diagnosed. But Salem was about something else. It was about demonstrating how testimony could be used as an instrument of control. And that lesson, having been learned by the community, did not need to be repeated. The apparatus was built. It could be forgotten. What the Salem trials reveal, if we have the courage to look clearly, is that the social pressure that silenced the women was not external to the system. It was the system. The magistrates did not try to protect the accuser's credibility and then fail. They constructed a situation in which women's testimony was granted authority long enough to serve its purpose, and then that authority was retroactively revoked. The afflicted girls were not victims of hysteria who were then forced to recant. They were given an opportunity to speak with unprecedented power, and when they extended that power beyond its intended boundaries, that opportunity was removed. The accused women were not fooled by a system they did not understand. They were trapped by a system that had no escape for them. The social pressure to silence was not informal or incidental. It was the deliberate consequence of institutional design. And the silence that followed the trials was itself an institutional mechanism, a choice not to examine what had happened, not to question the procedures that had produced it, not to protect against its repetition. The Salem trials ended, but they did not end cleanly. The survivors lived in a town that had nearly destroyed them. The survivors lived alongside the people who had accused them, or had convicted them, or had simply stood by and watched. Some families left. Some stayed and tried to rebuild within the same community that had fractured around them. The question of how to live after such violence is one that the historical record does not address. It addresses the official proceedings. It addresses the executions. It addresses the later exonerations and restitutions. What it does not address is the woman who wakes every morning knowing that her neighbors wanted her dead. What it does not address is the girl who realizes, as an adult, that her own words led to someone's execution. What it does not address is the way a community lives with what it has done, or refuses to live with it by choosing not to speak. The final silence of Salem is not the silence of the grave. The executed were buried. The records were kept. The stones that mark their graves exist in cemeteries today. People visit them. They leave flowers and remembrances. They tell the story of the trials to their children. But the story told is a sanitized story. It is a story about a moment when authority overreached and then corrected itself. It is not a story about women's testimony being weaponized. It is not a story about the machinery of social pressure. It is not a story about how to live afterward in a community that chose its victims. The silence is the choice to remember Salem as a mistake rather than as a revelation, as an aberration rather than as system, as a historical curiosity rather than as a warning about how authority uses the words of people without power. And that silence, the choice not to examine the mechanisms carefully, the choice to distance ourselves from it, that silence is the final erasure. The trials did not just kill the women. The trials killed the possibility of understanding how and why the women were killed, because to understand it fully would be to recognize that the same machinery might be built again, might be built differently, might be built in the moment we are living in right now, in ways we do not yet recognize. When historians look back at Salem today, they are looking at women through a document. That document was written by men who had authority. That document was written for purposes of prosecution. That document was written in the language of law, not the language of truth. And that document is the only voice we have from that moment that has been preserved, not the women's own reflections, not their own understanding, not their own words about their own experience, but the magistrate's transcription of those words, the recording of the accusation, the notation of the verdict. The archive is not neutral. It is a selection. It is a preservation of certain moments and an erasure of others. When we read the trial records, we are not meeting the women of Salem. We are meeting the women of Salem as they were made to appear in a system designed to destroy them. And the question we are left with is whether we have become any better at recognizing that difference. Whether we have built systems where testimony is preserved in its fullness, not just in its utility. Whether we have stopped assuming that the archive tells us truth, when what it actually tells us is power. This is where we are. The trials are 332 years in the past. The women who were executed are 3 centuries dead. The girls who accused them are also dead. The magistrates are dead. The community of Salem has moved on. New Salem exists as a tourist destination. There is a memorial. There are books. There are academic conferences. There is a cultural memory of Salem as a cautionary tale about hysteria and superstition. And within that cultural memory, there is a kind of absolution. We look back at 1692 and feel grateful that we are not living then. Grateful that we have moved beyond such barbarities. Grateful that we have laws to protect the innocent, procedures to ensure justice, institutions to guard against error. And in that gratitude, we permit ourselves not to examine whether those same mechanisms might be at work in the present. Whether the women whose testimony we solicit and record are being set up for the same kind of destruction, just under different names. Whether the social pressure to recant, to doubt your own account, to allow your words to be reinterpreted by authority. Whether that pressure is still being applied, just more subtly. Whether the system that killed 20 people in Salem in 1692 is truly gone, or whether it is simply sleeping, waiting for conditions to arise where it can be awakened again. That is the question the trials of Salem leave us with. That is the discomfort that remains when we look at the record. That is the silence we must learn to hear.